Hey everybody, Tim Alberg here, and thank you for listening to this week's episode of the Ask a YFP CFP segment of the Your Financial Pharmacist Podcast, where we feature questions from you, the YFP community, to be answered by one of YFP Planning's fee-only certified financial planners. Before we jump into today's question, I want to give a shout out to YFP Planning's incredible team that makes this segment possible. YFP Planning offers fee-only comprehensive financial planning that is customized to the pharmacy professional. You can learn more and book a free discovery call by visiting yfpplanning.com. Again, that's yfpplanning.com. Okay, Tim, this week's question comes from Sean, who asks, thoughts about purchasing I-bonds right now before the end of the month? And just a opportunity here to reframe this question. This came in right prior to we saw a decrease in the savings rate of the I-bonds. Tim, you'll probably talk about that here in a moment, from the high 9s into the 6s. And so Sean's asking, how are we now thinking about the I-bond purchase and the strategy of the I-bonds given the reduction in the savings rate? Tim Baker, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, so this question is spot on. Investors purchase, I think, nearly $7 billion in I-bonds in October, according to the Department of Treasury. So, I think the I-bond, which kind of tracks the inflation index, and with inflation kind of being a little bit high recently, a lot of people are trying to find ways to get a little bit more yield out of their cash and cash-like investments. So the I-bond's a great instrument for that. So just some facts about this: you can actually set these up on treasurydirect.gov. It's a little bit of a wonky process. Tim, we were just talking about this before. There's like a keyboard that you put your password in, like on the screen. It's kind of odd. You're limited to $10,000 per calendar year, so you could buy in increments anywhere from $25,000 to $10,000. The nice part about the I-bond, so everything's electronic, right? So you're not getting paper bonds or anything like that, like you did back in the day, or if grandma gave you an E-bond or a double E-bond. So it's everything's electronic. So the interesting thing about the I-bond, Tim, is that they don't lose value, and they're about as close to cash as you can get. So the I-bond is backed by the U.S. government, which is backed by the full faith and credit of the U.S. taxpayer, and it really it earns monthly interest, by two components. One is the fixed rate that can change every 6 months for new purchases, but stays the same after you buy it. So that's one of the changes that has. So when in recent months, that has always been basically logged at zero. But I think with this new issue, so post October, November to April, really the next 6 months, it's a fixed rate of 0.4%. The second component, Tim, is the variable rate, which changes every 6 months. So this is what's basically grabbing all the headlines, because in October and for the previous 6 months, that was at a 9.62% rate. Now it has since dropped to 6.89%, which is still the highest. It's the third highest rate it's been at since they introduced I-bonds back in '98. So it was at 7.12%, and it had a fixed rate at 0%. Then it jumped to 9.62% when a fixed rate at 0%. And then it decreased to 6.89%, which is basically what they're being issued at until April of next year. But the interesting thing about this, Tim, is that you get that 0.4%. So which is nice, because the bonds that I have from the previous purchasing, that fixed rate is at 0%. So if inflation goes down to zero, the bonds basically earn zero. So having that fixed rate component, if you buy now, is actually nice. So 2 times per year, the Treasury adds interest earned from the previous 6 months to your original investment. So now some of the rules that are important to know if you're looking at this is that essentially, from the day that you purchase to 12 months in the future, you can't touch those bonds at all. So that money is locked up. So if you put $10,000 in that, thinking that, hey, this is a perfect place to park my emergency fund, and then 6 months from now you lose your job and you need that $10,000 to pay the bills, it's not going to happen. So you cannot access those dollars. Now, from years 1 through 5, you can access that money, and you forfeit essentially 3 months worth of interest. So it's kind of similar to what you see with like a CD. I think the
Yep.
CDs that I have, you forfeit 2 months of interest. And then after year 5, there's no penalty to withdraw. So there is a little bit of liquidity concerns for people that are like, hey, I'm going to put my emergency fund in there. I would say this would be more of a deeper reserve if you are going that rate, because again, it's off limits for a full year. So to answer the question, yeah, like if you're looking at for ways to earn a little bit of yield where you see that inflation's kind of off the hook, your equity portfolio is not doing as well. This is a potentially good place to park, $25 to $10,000 again kind of ride the wave of inflation. So even though it's come down a little bit, I still think with the fixed component, there's a little bit of yield there left to be gained. But you just have to mind some of the the cons, which is the restriction of access. It's not a ton of money. So if you're trying to build out a portfolio and you're looking for a cash like $10,000 is not a ton of money if you're looking at a multi-million-dollar portfolio. So definitely pros and cons. It's very safe. Like I said, it's backed by the US government. So it's about as cash like as it gets, and then it has that inflation protection. So I'm a fan.
I'm a fan too. We'll link in the show notes to the treasurydirect.gov website if folks haven't been there before. Great educational information about I bonds. You can look at the rates, understand the fixed and variable component, and some of the rules and restrictions that Tim mentioned. We also talked about this on episode 239 when Tim and I talked about 2 I's that we should be thinking about as part of the financial plan, and that was inflation and I bonds. So make sure to check that out for some more information on that. Tim, I really like this, as you mentioned, as a deep reserve. We often talk about 3 to 6 months general rule of thumb for emergency fund. And is it 3 months? Is it 4 months? Is it 5 months? Right? Obviously, it depends on your personal situation. But
Yeah.
if you feel like you've got a really good base of an emergency fund and are looking for a little bit extra, but you don't want it sitting, even though we've seen the rates increase, you don't want it sitting, 2.4, 2.5, 2.6. This could be a good option to explore as long as you have that full understanding awareness that you can't touch it for a year. Tim, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on, you mentioned on this show before the value that it's something like a brokerage account can have when you have some of those more, near term expenses, right? Obviously, we don't want those tied up into retirement accounts. We don't want them sitting in a checking account or even a high yield savings account, perhaps either if it's going to be 3, 4, 5 years. So I'm thinking about things like, hey, I'm getting married, in a few years, or I'm looking to really buy a home or buy an investment property. Is this another vehicle that you might think of in lieu of a brokerage account or to supplement it? Tell us about that.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, my experience with like things like a purchase of a house where you're saying, we have a lot of clients who are like, "Hey, Tim, we're looking to buy a house in 2 years." And I usually cut that
Tomorrow.
in half, right? Yeah. So that happens a lot, believe it or not, where, it's such an emotional thing, and people start looking and they can see their stuff. Hey, we can do this with this room, and
Yeah.
that timeline goes out the window. So for something like that, I would say no. But if it's something like a wedding where there is a fixed date and you're like, hey, I don't need this, I don't need these dollars for um, a year or 2 years, like
Mhm.
that would definitely be something I would consider. Right now, again, the market is taking a beat in. So like kind of a rule of thumb that we follow is so say, Tim, like we need these dollars in 3 years. 3 years, it's kind of like that. It's like the opposite of the Goldilocks zone. So anything that's like 10, 20, 30 years, 20 years or more is kind of the sweet spot. Anything
Yeah.
that's like 20 years, um, like it's long-term investment. So like we know that, the market's going to go up and down, but overall it's going to go up.
Mhm.
And if it does go down, we have enough of a time horizon that it's going to recover. But if it's something like a year or 2 years, like the market could be up 40%, it could be down 40%, year over year. We just don't have no idea.
Yeah.
So that's where we're looking at something like an I bond, if we know that the timeline is true, something like a CD, something like a high yield savings account. So all of those are very safe. Some are more liquid than others. So it's a matter of like slotting where you're at. But, you might say, hey, it's 3 years, so we might put 30% equities and 70% bonds. And maybe part of that 70% is a CD or a high yield savings account or something like that, or an I bond. So it could be an aggregate bond fund. So that middle area is so tough because, again, you're in that where if the market does go down, you just don't have enough time to recover.
Yeah.
So then, really safety and principle is more important. So if your timeline is true, then the I bond, if it's more than a year out, that's the place to go. If you need something a little bit more liquid, then maybe I think CDs are paying like at Ally, again, that's where I bank. They're like 4%. I got another email yesterday that the high yield savings account is at 3% now. So that's continuously going up. So, we're at a point with where interest rates are that it doesn't make sense to put the money into the market for the short-term things, because I'd rather just have I'm super aggressive, I think, when it comes to the long term, but then with the short term, especially where rates are, I'm like, just get the sure thing. And that's I bonds, that's a CD, that's a high yield savings account. And, don't fret over what the market's going to do for the next year or two. So, but, we could talk about this for hours because there's a little bit of, okay, how do we best do this, get the most return, but not risk a whole lot. So, that's kind of the name of the game.
Great stuff. And again, Sean, thanks for taking time to submit your question. As a small thank you, we're going to be sending you a super comfy YFP t-shirt. And for those that are listening, we'd like to feature your question on an upcoming episode. You can either email us that question, info@yourfinancialpharmacist.com, or you can record your question by visiting yourfinancialpharmacist.com/ask YFP. As we wrap up this week's Ask a YFP CFP segment of the podcast, an important reminder that the content on this show is provided for informational purposes only and is not intended to provide and should not be relied on for investment or any other advice. For more information on this, you can visit yourfinancialpharmacist.com/disclaimer. Thanks for listening and have a great rest of your week.